Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first ever live broadcast of the HR Huddle. I'm your host, Teri Zipper, CEO and Managing Partner at Sapient Insights Group. As you can see us get through this for the first time, hopefully we don't have any major glitches. And this is a very special episode of HR We Have a Problem. If you haven't listened to the podcast before, this is the show where we break down the big and relevant HR issues of the day. We help you make sense of them, and we talk about what you might do about them. I've got an all-star cast with me today. I'm really excited to have Lisa Sterling. Lisa is an HR thought leader and somebody I've worked with in the past, and she's the Chief People Officer at Perceptics. And my partners and co-hosts, Susan Richards. Susan is the Sapient Insights founder. She's also a thought leader in all things change management and HR transformation, and just all around smart girl. And Stacey Harris, our Chief Research Officer. She is a thought leader in HR systems and the primary author of the HR systems white paper, which I know many of you have probably seen and read. Hopefully you read that 173-page report last year. So
every single word.
It was a wonderful book, right?
It was a novel.
It's a novel. Yes.
A bunch of amazing women, I think, challenging the status quo and disrupting the old ways of working for the last 20 years. So welcome, ladies.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Very good to be here. And I just want to make it an honest admission that crunching sound at the beginning of the session was all me. I was trying to watch the podcast on the other side of my screen. Didn't work, guys, just so you know.
Well, be careful when you do that, because you got a 10-second delay, so it's very confusing. So if we curse, we can edit
it out.
Edit it out if we want.
We don't do that, do we? Do I have a get out of jail free card?
We could probably come up with something. Yeah. So today's discussion was really born out of last year's survey results launch. The last couple of years have been really challenging, and HR has really stepped up and stepped out and frankly been stretched to the limits over the last couple of years. And at the same time, we didn't feel like they've gotten the recognition that they deserve. And even more so, really been included in some of the initiatives and things that could truly add value to the business and its success. So in some conversations, I'd like to really get into that conversation. I'd like to talk briefly about what we learned from the data and why we believe this is an issue, and then shift to what that looks like in real life, so kind of day in the life of an HR professional, and then talk about some actions or solutions that we can take to elicit change in our organization. Does that sound like a good plan to you all?
Sounds great.
Let's do it.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Go.
Let's get into the huddle. So I'd like to start with a definition. I do this on all my podcasts. I really like to just level set with people, like, what does this even mean? And so if I were to ask you, and I'm going to start with you, Susan, if I were to ask you to define in a word or a few words, strategic HR, what would you say?
From my perspective, strategic HR is an HR function that is focused on improving the results in the business. So a litmus test that I like to use with my HR colleagues is for every initiative that HR is tasked with or program that it comes up with, can we directly demonstrate how that's going to improve the potential results of the organization? So can we tie this initiative or this program or this new benefit to something that is going to help the organization achieve its business objectives and goals?
Awesome. Lisa, what about you?
I'm going to just use 3 words, and I think it encapsulates what Susan just said, and that's its value, its impact, and its outcomes. And I think that is our fundamental challenge with elevating HR to the strategic level, is we don't focus enough on the value, the outcomes, and the impact on the business, not just on the people.
Awesome. Stacy?
Yeah. And I mean, I think everything that Lisa and Susan said is really gives a good picture of where I think we want the world to be. But my commentary is that I think all HR is strategic. I think the conversation oftentimes is that we forget how strategic the little things are, like absence and leave management and time off and onboarding programs. All of that strategic. We just have to make sure that we're aligning that with what the business needs and the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And so I often like to flip it on its head and say, look, everything you do is strategic. Now the question is, how are you making sure it's adding value to the business? So yeah. I think it's really all about the outcomes, as everyone's talked about.
Yeah, very true. So last year we celebrated our 25th anniversary of the survey, and there was a ton of great information there, but this was the one thing that stood out to us, right? It was, how HR is perceived by the business from a strategic perspective. And we had literally just ended the restrictions from the pandemic when last year's survey was conducted. HR had done just a tremendous job of keeping the business moving forward during that 2 years. And we were asking the question, why is the perception of HR still flat? I'm gonna pop a chart up here just so people can see this, but this is what we were seeing in the survey, is that HR was sitting flat at about 46%. And if you look at our colleagues in finance and supply chain, they were closer to 60 and 70%. Again, this is the perception. And, we're asking the question, why is this? What gives, right? So this is how the 55 by 25 challenge was implemented. So we implemented that challenge last year to the entire community, with the focus being on how do we move that needle and help HR get into its proper place in the organization. So I want to start with the data, because I do think that chart was important, but I'd like to drill down a level, Stacy, and just talk about, what we saw there, and was it consistent? How did we look at it in terms of industry and size of org and things like that? Talk a little bit about that data and kind of what was swirling through your head.
Yeah, when I saw this number, I'll be honest, I was flummoxed is a really good word, right? Because I really thought after the pandemic and all the work we'd done and all the stuff, right, that we've been through, we were going to see that number jump up, because it was just everybody been talking about how much HR had added value during the pandemic and how they had shown their strategic value to organizations. And so when I saw that number sort of stay at that 46%, which is where it had been for 5 years straight, like we hadn't gone up in 5 years, we were around a round table looking at the data. And I remember the 3 of us, Lisa, you were in our minds, because we had a conversation about who else would be good to have this conversation with, right? I was like, help me, Susan and Teri, help me understand what's happening. And that's, I think, when we started talking about the reality of that, not only is it a perception issue, both for HR and outside of HR, but that it is also sometimes, I think, the things that HR focus on, doing all the right things in many cases, but the message they give to executives. So what we found in our data is we said, look, is this because it's a small business? Is this because we're seeing more global organizations participate in the research, right? Could any of that be impacting these numbers? And when I went back and analyzed it, and remember, we do this year over year, is that the correlation was not impacted by anything. In fact, small businesses were slightly more likely to be seen as strategic because their HR professionals were more closely aligned oftentimes with the business outcomes. Global organizations, we saw a slight drop in the Asia Pacific numbers, but not enough to impact the whole data set. So there really wasn't any other, maturity of the organization, process areas. So we ran correlations to see what were those things that were tied to it. And that's really what came out in the report. And, I think the conversation now is, look, we know HR is strategic. Just what is the process we need to go through to make sure the conversation gets to that level in every place we're having conversations about HR?
Yeah. Susan, you kind of took some of that data and took the report and tied this back to the organizations, as Stacy said, that had said they did have strategic value, or they felt like they were perceived as strategic. And that was an interesting list, because on the surface, I think the things that we learned there were, they didn't particularly seem like strategic actions, right? So tell us a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about what you saw and what your thoughts are on that. And then I want Lisa to weigh in on kind of, is she seeing that in her world, and how is that resonating?
Yeah, well, Stacy was flummoxed and I was pissed.
Yeah.
I remember sitting at that table and looking at the results, and I had a visceral reaction because I knew how hard our HR colleagues had worked for the last 2.5, 3 years to make sure that the lights stayed on. And when I realized that we still hadn't moved the needle in the year that I thought, oh, we finally arrived, we're going to do this, we are finally being perceived as strategic, it didn't move. It didn't move even one iota. So I was really upset. And so I was like, Stacy, what are the organizations that are being perceived as strategic? What are they doing? And so we started to look at things, and it was things like, I have transformational processes in absence and skills management, and I have a time management system in place that always meets the needs of the business. So they were things that, on the surface, it's like, well, that's not rocket science. That's what we do every single day. Maybe the piece about being focused on meeting expectations all the time makes sense, but this was bread and butter. And when we started to look at it more, I was like, okay, well, this does make sense, because things like absence management and leave management, those touch every single person in the organization at some point in their employee life. And they're highly emotionally charged. If I need to take a leave of absence, it's because something's happening. Either it's really good or it's really bad. And I'm going to create a void in my organization because I'm walking away from my job. So it's creating an emotional issue for my manager. And if HR is seen as being strategic around those things and solving those problems, we're solving problems for the organization, and we're creating value for the organization, and we're making an impact. Lisa, I'm using your words. I'm going to be building a tool off of that. Just wait and see. So it was the things that impact a lot of people at different points in their life, and where HR, if we do it consistently, and if we do it well, and if we do it in service to the organization, can have a huge impact. Now, if we design a process that's really good for HR and includes a boatload of checks and balances, and we don't let people use mobile systems, and we hold everything close to us, then we're not going to be perceived as strategic. If we let go and let the business operate and trust that our employees know what they need, and give them access to that, then we are going to be seen as much more strategic. And then the other thing that I wasn't surprised about in those strategic HR organizations is those organizations are seen as being good change agents. And I think that's the thing, that's a lever that HR practitioners can grab onto and lean into and have a huge impact in their organization. If we as HR people are accustomed to change, we do it all the time, we can teach others how to do it. We know who is going to be excited about change and who's not going to be excited about it, because we know the people in our organization. And if we lean into those things and raise our hand and step out and lead that change management effort around a technology implementation or around a merger acquisition or around a product launch, then we become those strategic partners to the organization, to the point that the organization seeks us out instead of us having to beg for a seat at the table.
Yeah. Lisa, I saw you shaking your head, and I know you've been on the ground for a while in C-suite roles, CHRO, CPO, and other C-suite positions in the organizations across a couple different organizations. How do these findings resonate with you, and sort of what was your reaction, and kind of what was the first thing you said when you saw that?
Yeah. I mean, now piss Susan off by saying this. I'm not shocked by this, and not at all that the needle hasn't moved. And you said something, Susan, that I think proves to me why I'm not surprised. And that is the last couple of years have been spent keeping the lights on. And as a CHRO, that's what we've been doing. We have been trying to just keep the organizations moving forward and making sure we could get people out of the office, back to the office, keeping their well-being, their safety, all those things moving forward. And honestly, it has slowed down some of the other work that had really started to be invested in pre-pandemic. And it's been challenging for a lot of CHROs to step back into some of those priorities and really get aggressive and provocative in moving them forward. And so I know you had a visceral response. Mine was like, what did we expect? Honestly, I do not see from where I sit right now that we have elevated to that true strategic area. And I think I look at it from a different vantage point, right? Like the employees at Perceptix expect the things that we're talking about right now. They don't think that's strategic. They expect you to demonstrate empathy and compassion and have an entire experience around leave management. That's part of our jobs, right? So I think it depends on the lens of who you're talking to, if what we're doing is really strategic or not. Because I'll tell you, I don't find that to be something that I put a lot of emphasis on in driving our business forward. That's just something we have to do. I don't find that to be something I would call out as being strategic. So it's interesting that the organizations, that there is a correlation between that. And I'm not negating the data whatsoever, because I see where it is. I guess from where I sit, for me, that's an expectation. If you don't do some of those things, you shouldn't be in this business, right? The piece I will double click on, though, is that adaptive change management. And I could not agree with you more, Susan, on just the importance behind that, right? People want to understand why. They want to understand so what. And where I have found for some of these things to really elevate to a new level, and people on the ground and people leaders to say, yes, my people team or my HR team is thinking strategically, they're acting strategically. It's when they understand what the hell we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think that is such a simple thing, but so many organizations miss that part when it comes to change management. They don't bring the people along for the ride. They make people feel like things are being done to them, right? And that is where there becomes this separation and this disconnect between strategic HR and how the people feel, right? And I'm seeing glimpses of that getting better. I think if we can really double down in that area and be more thought leaders and drive that, we are going to see people's perception of the HR function become more strategic. And I really think that the 55 by 25 becomes something that is absolutely achievable. I would hope that it's doesn't flow as nicely, but 60 by 25, right? It doesn't come off the tongue nearly as well. I'm myself trying to say that, but let's go with 75 by 25.
There you go. There you go.
So would love to see that.
Yeah, no, I think we're all in for more, right? Like, it would be great. And I just want, so Lisa, I love the fact that you're sort of commenting that like lead management shouldn't be like, that's table stakes, right? And I think when we saw that data, we had sort of the same reaction, right? Why is this popping and not something like, talent acquisition, which really seems like it's a lot more strategic. And I don't know that we know the answer. I think that's part of why we're having some of these conversations is it because maybe leave is something people see? And so if it isn't happening, then you can't get to be strategic, right? Like, so there's a lot of reasons why some of these things come up. That's the nice thing about correlations. You don't know what's causation versus correlation, right?
Yeah. I'm just going to add that, well, I'm just going to add this image to the screen for a second, just so you guys can see. There were some things that were very negatively correlated to success. That's on the left. And then the things on the right were positively correlated to success. So those were the things that Susan talked about: the adaptive change management, workforce planning, time management, some of those table stakes items. But again, there were also some things that were somewhat negatively correlated. I don't know, Stacey, if you have any comments on that column.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot there that has to do with sort of SMB organizations. I think SMBs have some additional hurdles that they're dealing with in the fact that they oftentimes have fewer resources in their organizations to manage the HR function. But when you really look at the bottom three, reactive approach to data management inside your organization, sure, Lisa, your whole company would completely buy into like just not being in front of it, right? And then issues like the other side of that, which is not being mobile friendly, right? Which means you're not making everything accessible. Susan talked about that. Again, not surprising, but those are the harder things oftentimes than, that take a lot of getting in and really getting with, the messy work of HR, right? To get it done. That would be my sense of why it's harder to do those.
Yeah.
Yeah. And listening to Lisa talk about the adaptive change management opportunity that we have in front of us. So many organizations think communications and training will get the job done with change. And it's that other piece of change that's called engagement. So figuring out where your employees are on the spectrum. Are they neutral? Are they negative about this change? Are they positive about it? Can we make them champions or help them become champions? Can we get those folks who are negative to at least a neutral position? And it can't just be, I'm going to send you 50,000 emails about how fabulous this is. I need to actually understand what's in it for each individual person or each individual stakeholder group and share that with them and demonstrate it to them in a way that they can understand and appreciate and that they can get on board with. And all the communications and training in the world won't do that. There's hard work that comes along with that. And HR is really well positioned to do that if we can get out of our own way.
Yeah.
And I would lean into that further, Susan. I 100% agree with what you said. We have to create connectivity in the communication that we're using, right? And having multi-channel communication strategies is important. But again, we have to connect to the why, right? Like I'll use a prime example, right? Like organizations, as we all have seen over the past 6 months, have gone through multiple renditions of layoffs and rifts or whatever those things might be, right? And communicating to employees that this is happening, how it's going to play out, et cetera, is not enough. You have to step back and explain to them why. Help them understand the state of your business. If you are having financial challenges, explain that. If your sales cycle is taking longer and so you're missing forecasts, explain that. Be so crystal clear and transparent with your employee that it doesn't leave an opportunity for them to wonder, right? Because just throwing more information at them and giving them the data doesn't necessarily help them connect that, right? We have to remember we have all different levels of maturity of humans in our organization. And we speak in languages sometimes that some employees are just like, what in the hell are you saying? Like, I don't know what that means. Get it down to their level and help them understand the why. And we unfortunately went through this in one of my previous organizations. And I cannot tell you how this is going to sound, but a bad situation was made to be very, very positive when our people understood why we were making the decisions that we were making and what we were going to do to ensure that we weren't going to have to do that again. It fundamentally changed, back to using your word, the engagement of our people, and it got people rallied to where they wanted to step up and provide even additional discretionary effort to take our company forward. It's not, to your point earlier, it's not rocket science.
But well, Lisa, I would love to ask you this because you've been in this seat, and I think we've all been in the seat in different times in different places. But if your CEO doesn't understand the value of transparency, they're afraid of sharing too much with the company, how do you help them understand the value of that why? Because I think that's the thing that we hear from a lot of the HR professionals is my executives don't understand why I need to do some of the things I need to do. Have you run into that before?
Yes. I have to say, for clarification, not here at Perceptics, John is probably one of the most connected people to this. But yes, I've had a partner in my CEO in the past that didn't understand that. And you know, when you have serial entrepreneurs that are CEOs who have built and sold companies, sometimes it's harder for them to connect to some of that, right? They don't connect to the emotionality and that level of engagement. That's where I say, as the people leader, bring data and not engagement data, right? Because again, we're in this business, but I say this all the time to our own people. I don't care about our engagement score. So what? Help me understand what that means. If our people are engaged, how are they adding value to the business? If they're not engaged, how are they taking away value from the company? The engagement itself becomes irrelevant, right? That's what we need to do as CHROs. Enter those conversations with data. If you have a CEO who is not connected emotionally to having an engaged or disengaged workforce, help them understand the business implications of not having that connection, not having that level of engagement. And that's where, you know, take things like turnover. Okay, great. Our turnover is at 25%. Again, I say, so what? What is important is, what's the lost opportunity cost to the business when we have high degrees of turnover, right? So speak in languages that make sense to them. And if you're uncomfortable speaking in that language, we got a bigger problem. Like HR, we have a problem, right? Because I have seen CHROs who talk in people analytics, not business analytics. And people analytics have a thread to business analytics. Combine those two things and bring them together to tell a compelling story that is going to trigger something in your CEO or CFO or COO that's going to help move the needle quickly.
Love that.
Yeah.
We use that across the board.
Yeah. You know, Susan, you said something a couple of weeks ago, and this ties right into that, which is,
okay.
Okay, it's not just us.
And I have no idea what I said a couple of weeks ago.
Teri, are you back? We missed it.
We missed you.
Yeah, my screen just went blank. But what I said was, Susan, that whole conversation about storytelling, like HR has not really been good about being able to tell the story. And I think that's exactly what Lisa's talking about, is tying the people analytics to the business analytics. There's a story there. It's kind of like when you go to the doctor and they go through, you know, all this technical speak about what's wrong with you. And you go out of there and you're like, somebody's like, well, what'd they say? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. Here's the word, you know, this is what I got. Right. And understand nothing, because they didn't really know how to tell me what it was that was wrong with me in a way that I could understand. Well,
So what? It's like, okay, am I going to live or am I going to die? Or, you know, is this something I can control? You know, using the storytelling, combining the data and the business KPIs with the people thread, and talking about, so what is painting the picture of what it looks like if our turnover, it goes from 25% to 30%. What does that look like in lost productivity and increased cost to replace those resources, and the amount of time that it's going to take to get those new resources to productivity, and what the revenue per employee is going to drop to as a result. That's how you get the CEO's attention. And whichever C person you're going to be talking to, whether it's the CIO, the CFO, the COO, the CEO, or the board, understand what metrics they care about and tie our story directly to those metrics. And then they start to listen to us.
Susan, you bring up such a valid point. I just want to go back to something you said earlier, Stacey, about, you know, the surprise of like talent acquisition, not making this list of strategic HR, right? What we are talking about right now, in my opinion, is one of the reasons why TA teams don't show up as strategic, is because they focus on all the wrong analytics, right? Like you hear them talk about, oh, my time to fill went from 45 days to 41 days. My cost per hire went from that. again, I go back to, so what? My first question is, why the hell does it take you 41 days to hire a human for a job? First of all, let's just be honest. And secondly, what does that mean to the business, right? It's okay. So it took 41 days. Well, the different roles in in organizations have different levels of impact, right? If you're a tech company and your DevOps person is gone, having an open DevOps role has a significant cost to the business for not having a human in that seat, right? If you are a revenue generating team and you've lost your sales folks, huge loss to the organization. That is not the conversation that happens in the board meetings. HR people bring to the board meeting those traditional talent acquisition analytics, right? And so that doesn't make talent acquisition show up as strategic. It shows up as a tactical team that gets people in the door. When you change the conversation and you change the discussion around how you're creating impact, you change and elevate the level of what that function or that team or that capability does for an organization. And I can't stress this enough, that the CHRO's role is to help bring that thread from people analytics to business analytics if they really want to be seen by the board specifically as strategic.
I love, Lisa, I love the whole board connection, because the one thing we know that gets to the board is compensation data and turnover data, right? Like that's the thing they all see. So we have a really great question from Rupert Bader. I just want to bring it in, and then Teri, we can sort of follow it on your threads. He wanted to understand, he also congratulated us on getting the link between people and business analytics in at 26 minutes into our conversation. So, but Rupert wanted to know about the reactive data management and the tie to workforce planning. And I think you were kind of heading there, Lisa, with the board cares about workforce planning, but not in the terms of sort of turnover or open positions. They care about it in bottom line numbers, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's, again, if the board can understand what type of lost opportunity that cost there is to the business, that matters to them, right? And it helps them understand what levers need to be pulled and in what areas. And again, not all roles are created equal. And I see organizations come forward with their workforce plans and everything 1 + 1 = 2, right? That is not the case in workforce planning whatsoever. And there's an opportunity here to change that conversation, not just at the board level, but at the executive level, in the talent acquisition teams level. And I'm not picking on them. There's other elements of the business too, right? That aren't seen as really strategic right now. Like I think about a lot of total rewards teams. We talk about comp, right? There's so much strategy that goes into that whole total rewards philosophy, but we don't tell the right story.
Right.
Yeah.
And knowing that not all roles are created equal I think that's hard for HR to stomach, because we want to think that, all of the positions are important. Well, most of them are. There are some that are critical, and there shouldn't be more than, 10 to 15 roles in the organization that are critical to make sure that you've got those roles filled and you have backfill plans and succession plans for all of those, and make sure that those are the roles that folks are focused on, that you have your top recruiters focused on, and that you can tell that story. Everything else is important too, but there is a critical few that they will make or break the organization. And as CHROs, we have to know what those are, and we have to have a plan.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Stacey, you talk to a lot of vendor organizations all the time. And I know we've started to see vendors doing things to lean into this issue themselves, right? And just to Rupert's question, right? How is this, how is this working? So what are you seeing in terms of the vendor community leaning into this challenge?
And it's a great question. And I'd say some vendors are really embracing it. And what's been surprising is it's not just sort of the big ERPs, right? We know that, SAP, Oracle, Workday, they've been talking about this for a long time, right? And those are really complex conversations that they oftentimes have. But we're even seeing organizations at the smallest level of the SMB market, right, talking about strategic HR as an important component. And that's what I think excites me. And those that are in sort of minor niche areas like compensation or in rewards and recognition or engagement, right? So I think the thing is that we are seeing the vendors step into this. My challenge right now is that many times they don't have the tools and they don't have the know-how oftentimes to connect with HR in the right way to help them. They've got a lot of marketing and a lot of branding around HR is strategic, but they don't know how to build either a services function or partner with some of the services functions to focus on HR's skill sets and capabilities. And I'm just going to be a little bit, forgive me, I can be a little grumpy sometimes, but service organizations, the SIs, the implementation firms, please stop trying to go around the HR profession and to the head of strategy or to the CEO to get a bigger project, because that HR professional needs you to make sure that they've got the hands on the ground to do the job. And the more you try and get a bigger project every time, you're just continuing to elevate this issue that HR isn't strategic. So please, service organizations, do your job, work with HR. So sorry. But yeah, that would be my thing, is that it's a conversation about not knowing how to make that connection with services and making sure you're working well with these implementation firms who are out there. I'm sure I'm going to get some comments about that on the right. And I'd love to hear the audience's questions for the HR vendors as well. So if anybody's out there and got a question for HR vendors, we'll try and answer that today too.
And Lisa, you've got some experience there with some of the vendors you've been with. What's your reaction to that? Is Stacy on point there?
She is. She absolutely is. And I will say, in full disclosure, part of my role in one of my previous organizations, name unsaid, was actually to be part of the strategy team on the product side, right? Because if you look at some of these big HCM providers or HRS providers, what have you, these are people who have never sat in my chair. They've never sat in an HR chair, and yet they're building technology for me and for the rest of the employees, right? And I will say there are a number of them that are starting to pivot and are really leaning into the CHROs, either in their client base or they're bringing in people into their product organization who have been heads of HR, CHROs, et cetera. And so Stacy, don't apologize. First of all, I think what you said, everybody needs to hear that. I've had those SIs want to bypass me, and then I sit back and giggle and be like, good luck with that, because when I explain how this process didn't work, you're definitely not getting more business from our CEO. That said, lean into the people who know, right? Like I have this philosophy in my life as a CHRO that probably 90% of the challenges that we face as a company, people in our organization have the answers to. They just don't have the podium or the power to speak up and give that, right? Same comes with this, right? If you're going to go build product for HR people or for people in their roles, go talk to them, go to where the action is and ask, get them involved in the conversation, right? Because I've seen a whole lot of what was well-intended capabilities in systems fall flat because there wasn't a valid use case for them in our roles as CHROs or in our organizations as HR professionals. So there's nothing wrong with asking, right? Go get insight.
Yeah. I mean, in my experience and, working with tech vendors in the past as well, and being on the tech vendor side, it was very hard sometimes to get people to understand why we should get the input of people who actually are going to use the software. It's like, we know what it needs to do. Yeah, but everything happens in context. And so, being able to see things in real time and experience some of them in real time, it's just amazing the things that uncovers and starts to help organizations better understand how this is going to work. And does it even make sense what we're trying to do?
And I have an additional perspective. I think HR leaders have a responsibility to speak up and say what they need, and not back off from their budgets or their ask in these big implementations. I'll tell you, having been on the implementation side of the house for a very long time, the first thing that gets cut from a budget is change management.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing that gets cut from the budget is strategy work. And so, yes, the system integrators, our consultants, need to work with HR. HR needs to fight to actually have those resources available to them. So building your business case, helping the organization understand why you need change management in your implementation plan, why you need to have HR strategy work built into the implementation plan. Those are all things that we as leaders in HR have to be able to articulate and have to be able to defend.
Then we're right back to the storytelling.
Exactly.
Yeah. How do I make this into a story that people will understand and actually have a visceral reaction to, like you had, right? When you saw the data, right?
Yeah.
You need that visceral reaction for people to actually move and do something.
Exactly.
And I'm not sure as HR people, we always want, our goal is to get people to have a visceral reaction, right? But I think when
maybe that needs to change.
When we fight for something, I mean, how else are you going to do it, right? Yeah, I'm curious. There's a couple of things that are, we're hearing about, and obviously HR is in a unique position as things happen in the world that start to come back and affect people. I'm curious if you guys are seeing what the impact is around HR from, one, a burnout perspective, because we've seen a lot of longtime HR people walk out the door. That was something else we saw in the survey last year, was that people with 10 or more years of experience in HR were disappearing. And then coming back to the officers, and we could do a whole session on this, but there's a lot that whole pendulum on remote hybrid work, that thing is not slowing down, right? And so these are all things that obviously impact HR and their ability to solve for some of these things or help people through some of these things as they're experiencing them at the same time. It is, to me, a real challenge. I don't know, Lisa, if you have any reaction to that.
No, it's such a timely conversation. And I would say, given that specific example that you shared with are we remote? Are we hybrid? Are we going back to an office? So, there's so many emotions that come with that for people. I think combine that with, we've gone through some economic headwinds, right? And I'm not sure if we're going to have more. I mean, some indications say we are. You start to wrap this all together, and we really are kind of in this perfect storm. It's brewing right now, right? And so I can understand why some folks who have long tenure in HR have said, listen, this is a lot. This is one of those places where, at least in my experience, and maybe it's the executive team that I'm surrounded by, that makes this a little bit easier, but we come through the lens of a lot of these conversations that these aren't HR things. These are organizational issues. Being remote, hybrid, having a physical footprint, that is not HR's job only, right? That is everybody's. There is a team of executives and senior leaders that sit within our organizations. DEI and B, not HR's responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility. And I think this is going back to, I think, Stacey, this was you that said it, or maybe it was you, Susan, that said, we have to speak up. Don't be afraid to use our voice. When somebody comes at me and says, Lisa, I need you to fix DEI and B, I'm like, great, let's get the executive team sitting down. You want to be a part of this? Great. Let's sit down and solve for what our strategy is going to be. You're not handing this to HR and saying this is HR's responsibility. And I think people in the roles like mine and others need to be confident and aggressive enough to stand up and say those things, right? Because if we don't, we're just going to continue to be the ones that are in the driver's seat of all of these things. And there's going to be more of whatever these things are, right? As our economic changes happen, as our societal changes happen, global impacts, we have to change that dynamic and that conversation to really being more collective in solving for these things. And some of my team members are on this call right now, and they could give me an amen by me saying this, but I am very clear with them that you prioritize the things that are going to have the greatest impact, and you say not now to everything else. And if that means putting things on hold that you've been working on for 2.5 years, Sorry, they're going on hold. Then we're clear with our story to our employees why they're going on hold and what's coming in its place, right? We've got to stop trying to do everything because we hear over here in a survey or a listening event or on Glassdoor that somebody's frustrated about something. And back to the prioritization, not everything has the same value and should be prioritized just because somebody has an issue with it or wants it, right? This is just one of those things that gets me fired up because we continue to take on more and more and more, and we've got to start being smarter about really looking at things more holistically.
Yeah. And Lisa, and Lisa, sometimes those pet projects that come from our executives are the things that we need to learn to say no to.
Yes.
You know, a CFO who wants something, who has a very loud voice, that project might not be the right project. And us being prepared with the why not is incredibly important.
Yeah. It's important that we can tell the story, right? Like, I think that gets back to the conversation we just had, that someone squeaky wheel does not mean there's bottom line value, right? I love the do less with less, right? Mantra, instead of do more with less. Because I think so often we pick up extra work. Brian Hobzuk just also put in the chat line, I think this gets right to this conversation we're having here. He wants to understand how you get budget for workforce planning efforts when you're kind of competing with finance in this space. And how do you have that conversation where HR and finance become partners? I think this is, oftentimes we do feel like we're in competition between HR, finance, and oftentimes marketing and operations for resources and budgets when we really should be collaborating. But I don't know that collaboration is how we think about those roles oftentimes, especially with finance as an inside, they know what the numbers are oftentimes, right?
100%. But I will say, Brian, to you, other than my relationship with my CEO, either in my current org or in past, the CFO is my second relationship that I nurture and I embrace. And I will tell you, if you go back and talk to my current CFO and the past two, they will all tell you that our relationship was highly collaborative. And it goes back to coming at this with a different mindset, right? I've seen this all too often. The HR team comes forward with this crazy workforce plan that's all about headcount increases and, large budgetary dollar amounts when we're not even optimizing the talent that we have. And I'll use a prime example. I was on my call with my CFO here at Perceptix yesterday, and I said to him, I'm honestly tired of people telling me that they're overworked. There's so much optimization yet to be had in all of our organizations that until you have optimized and streamlined your function to the point you can't anymore, please don't ask me for another headcount. And I'm saying that to my own team, right? Like, we are not going to add more bodies until we have uncovered all the other areas that optimization needs to happen. And that could be automation, that could be a new tech stack, that could be reallocation of work based on people's strengths. So you have more people doing what they're exceptionally good at and are more productive. But when you have that kind of conversation with your CFO's perspective and perception of you also gets elevated, and there is more collaboration. When you're just seen as the person coming and asking money for lots of systems and people and stuff, it's hard, right? There's a combative, because to your point, Stacey, there's a conflict of interest sometimes there, and we come at each other in the wrong way. Come at them from the point of, like, I'm trying to help move this business forward as well in a profitable manner, right? Like, that's where all companies need to be right now. So again, we just have to change the conversation, and back to storytelling, tell a different story.
Yeah. Well, and I think something else you said there, Lisa, to me really matters, which is relationships. And this is one of the things we talked heavily about last year in the workshop. You've got to have relationships. If you want to be able to collaborate, you've got to have relationships with those people in the organization that you can collaborate with. It's not going to be, I'm going to go to the COO or the CEO and I'm going to tell him to make finance do this, right? Or tell her to, make operations do this. So yeah, it's all about being able to create those relationships.
Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about the things that I think we would suggest to people. So I'd hoped to transition into that, but we just sort of talked about it anyway. And we're just about to wrap up here, but I wanted to get one last thing from you guys. If you could share one action that people could take today, right now, leaving this session, because I know a lot of people are thinking, oh my God, it's so big. I don't know how, like, it's too big. How can I start to compartmentalize this, put it into small buckets? And is there something I could walk out of here today and do something to help me get started on this journey that we've talked about? So Lisa, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, mine's really simple, and it's not it's not rocket science, right? Go speak to the people who can help you move things forward, right? Go have those conversations and look outside of your traditional group of people that you seek information from, right? Like, I am a big believer, I said this earlier, the answers to the questions and the challenges that we have already exist within our organization. We're asking the wrong people, and stop trying to solve it from where you sit. So if you want HR to be seen as more strategic in your organization, go talk to the people who view the HR team as either strategic or non-strategic right now, and pull those elements from them. It's not difficult. It's just time. You just have to make the time. But if you don't, you're never going to get to where you need to be.
Now, Susan?
I'd say figure out what your one critical thing is. So what is the highest priority item on your project list right now? And that's, if you can identify what that is and start to put the focus there, and it's something that is going to move the needle for the business, you're going to have a story to tell.
Stacey?
All right. I'm not going to follow the rules because I'm not really good at that. I've got two, not one. So the first one's a little self-serving, but I do think it's important. I think you need to do some self-reflection. You've got to know where you stand and be honest about currently what your perception is, what systems you have, what data you have. So my first thing is a really easy way to start that is to take our survey. The annual HR system survey is live right now, guys. So a little self-serving, but I do think it's a great way to just think about all the questions you need to ask yourself about your HR environment. But second one, on just a really practical level, look at the data you're sharing with your executives on a weekly or monthly basis. What are those metrics you're putting forward? And ask yourself, are they telling the right story? Am I giving the right context around them? Just taking that step. And if you're not sharing something with executives on a weekly or monthly basis, why? Then go ask them what you should be sharing. Because I think the biggest thing that we in HR forget is we have data. Even if it's not perfect or clean, then executives need to see that so they tell their people to put in the right data. We've got to start sharing our data and asking ourselves if it's telling the story we need to tell right now. So that would be my one step. So.
Awesome. Well, that takes me to a slight little plug here where I'm going to say, don't forget to take the survey this year. It is out, and the public launch is today. So we want to hear from you, and we want to see what happens with the data this fall when we'll be at HR Tech to talk about that. And also, if you aren't already a member of this group, Raising the Bar on HR, love for you to join that as we continue to elevate the conversation. Thanks, Lisa, Stacey, Susan, for joining us today. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. And I want to thank our producers, Brand Method Media Group, who did a lot to get this thing going today. And Lisa and Zoe, who I know are sweating in the background as we finish this session up, but they just did a fantastic job of making this LinkedIn session happen. So I'm super excited. And if you guys liked it, let us know, because we'll plan to do some more. And thank you for tuning in. That's all we have for today's episode of HR We Have a Problem. We hope you'll subscribe to our podcast and listen to it again, because it'll be out next week. You can also drop us a line or schedule a chat on the website. We will see you again in 2 weeks with another episode of HR We Have a Problem. Thanks everybody.
Bye.
Take us out, Zoe.
Yeah.